Do we need men?
No. Because men are useless. I mean, love you. And by the way, I wanted the
About a year ago, The New Yorker ran a story about how Agnes Callard, an American writer and philosopher working out of the University of Chicago, left her husband so she could pursue a relationship with one of her graduate students. Now, this is far from a gendered problem. Male professors have been cheating on and leaving their wives for students for longer than the wheel has been around. But what struck me when I read this article was the sympathetic way that the situation was treated in a very prestigious literary magazine. Hell, the fact that it should be published in the first place seemed bizarre. Callard was and is a professor of philosophy, and this student would come to her office hours to discuss Aristotle. And one day, he professed his love for her, and she realized that she felt the same way. He was 27, she was 35 with a husband and 2 sons. At first, both agreed to leave it alone, but days later, Callard reconsidered and decided that she needed to leave her husband. And what I found most interesting was the way that she moralized her decision. From the article. On the plane, Agnes said, "It felt like I was having a revelation in the clouds. For the first time in her life, she felt as if she had access to a certain inner experience of love. A state that made her feel as if there were suddenly a moral grail, a better kind of person to be. She realized that within her marriage, she didn't have this experience. If she stayed married, she would be pretending." She told her husband, who eventually agreed to the divorce, but there was still the matter of what a divorce might do to her children. To quote again, Agnes was extremely upset that the divorce would harm her children, but she felt that the alternative was that she would become a bad person. "I thought that I would become sort of corrupted by staying in a marriage where I no longer felt like I was aspirational about it," she said. Bear with me. A lot of the time when I'm doing this kind of research, I have to sanity check by just summarizing stuff out loud. This is a philosophy professor specializing in fucking ethics, saying that if she didn't leave her husband to fuck one of her students, she would be a bad person. Ethics! Now, I cannot boast the same educational credentials that Ms. Callard can, but I seem to recall that ethics is fundamentally about duty, about restrictions on self-interest. And when Agnes Callard turns her own sexual desire into a transcendent moral command that requires her to abandon her husband and harm her children, it's just too insulting to my intelligence to pretend that I can't see how obviously self-serving this is. I submit to you that this article simply would not have been written if the subject had been a man. And these pseudo-moral rationalizations would have fallen flatter than, I don't know, something really flat. Sure, there have always been men who walked away from their responsibilities, but they've never been celebrated for it. They've never had positive articles written about how choosing to leave their wife and kids was actually the moral choice, that if they hadn't left, they would be bad people, and that you'd know that if you just had a PhD in ethics, you stupid chud. Shit. We're gonna have to do a hard reset here. I promise that I actually did want to talk about a movie. Okay, let's try this again. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. And sometimes a monster is just a monster. Jaws is just a big shark, the leeches from Slither are just gross slugs, and the xenomorph from Alien is just
perfect organism.
But there are other times when a cigar isn't just a cigar. And likewise, there are times when a monster isn't just a monster. These are the movies that I find especially interesting, when the horrors on the screen aren't just the spectacle that you see in front of you. Instead, they have a double presence, representing something more subtle or abstract. For some modern examples, we could point to The Babadook, in which the creature represents depression and isolation, or It Follows, in which it is, depending on who you ask, a symbol for STDs or knowledge of one's mortality. For older examples, you could mention Godzilla, in which the Titan represents the horrors of the atomic bomb, and in the pre-film world, you could even look to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, in which the monster represents the consequences of man's hubristic desire to transcend mortality through science. Sting tells the story of a 12-year-old girl named Charlotte and her family as they attempt to weather a powerful blizzard in New York City. Sneaking into her grandmother's room one night, she encounters a seemingly normal house spider, and after naming it Sting and giving it a home in a glass jar, Charlotte begins to notice that there is something strange about Sting. Initially, Charlotte feeds her on a diet of cockroaches, but Sting grows with impossible speed, and eventually, she's strong enough to leave her jar and go on her own nighttime feeding excursions. Her prey quickly escalates, as does her size, until she poses a threat to everyone in the apartment, and Charlotte and her family must band together to take down her once pet. On its surface, Sting might seem like it's just a campy indie horror film about a jumped-up space spider terrorizing a bunch of apartment dwellers. But as the characters develop and the dynamics of their relationships become increasingly strained, another kind of horror seems to rise up out of the film. The terror of toxic femininity. Maybe this will go a little bit more smoothly if I lay down some groundwork first. The first thing that ought to be established is the existence of toxic femininity. To my mind, it's pretty obvious that if there is such a thing as toxic masculinity, male gender norms and behaviors that are, on the whole, seen as negative, then there must be such a thing as toxic femininity. However, there is much less agreement on what this would entail, since basically all conversation on the subject is shut down by people for whom words like incel and manchild constitute a solid 40% of their vocabulary. And in case any of those people happen to be watching this video, howdy hey, welcome to the barking ears. You're not going to like it here. But I'm going to proceed on the assumption that you aren't an idiot. So we ought to agree that toxic femininity must exist, even if only in theory. Sting follows Charlotte, a 12-year-old girl living in New York City with her mother, Heather, her grandmother, her great-aunt, her stepfather, Ethan, and a newborn brother. Together they live in a dilapidated apartment building that's owned by the aunt, a woman with an old-world accent and a Third Reich attitude. Financially, the family doesn't seem to be doing great, but this is mostly conveyed through the fact that both Ethan and Heather seem overwhelmed by work. Ethan is a comic book artist by trade, but he's also working as a building supervisor for the aunt. In return, they get to stay in the apartment free of charge.
You like this job, yeah? You're paying a rent. This is good, yeah?
Definitely, yes.
But then maybe she also pays him on top of that. It's not entirely clear. The point is that Ethan and Heather are stressed. Everybody's stressed. One night, as Charlotte sneaks into her grandmother's apartment to steal a doll, she comes across Sting, a cute little spider who hopped a ride on a meteor just to arrive on the Lower East Side. Charlotte kind of has this tomboy goth girl thing going on. Are goth girls even still a thing? I have no idea. But whatever, she takes Sting home and puts her in a jar. Being from a different planet, Sting has a pretty impressive kit of perks. The most important of which is that she seems to have the ability to mimic sounds. She doesn't seem to have it, she just has it. Why do I write this stuff? And also a degree of intelligence that allows her to bond with Charlotte. Charlotte will whistle to Sting, and Sting can somehow whistle back, creating the impression that the two have some kind of connection. And, of course, in a way they do. Charlotte, too, is relatively new in the world, just beginning to enter adolescence and experience all the confusion associated with it. She's also a little toxic herself. When we first see her, she's breaking into her grandmother's apartment in order to steal one of the old woman's dolls, which she plans to deface and destroy for her social media followers. When confronted by her stepfather about the doll, she lies to his face, which isn't that unusual for a kid, but it's the smug way that she does it that's kind of annoying. And so when she picks up Sting and begins to take care of her and feed her, it's sort of like she's nursing some small toxic element within herself. Sting's first appearance also strengthens her connection with femininity. When she first arrives, her tiny egg lands inside the grandmother's dollhouse, a toy with obvious associations with girls and girlhood, and the opening titles follow Sting making her way through this dollhouse as the Pleasure Seekers' What a Way to Die plays in the background. The lyrics are about alcoholism and dysfunctional relationships, and in the dollhouse, Sting appears as enormous as she's destined to become. In a nice touch by the director, the scene ends with Sting descending onto a tiny crib, indicating, even before we've been introduced to the family, that Charlotte's little brother will be Sting's ultimate target. Sting starts off small, but she grows extraordinarily quickly, and so does her appetite. She moves from eating the bugs that Charlotte provides her to pets, escaping from her jar at night and using the ventilation ducts to move through the apartment, much the same way that Charlotte did. And when she kills the aunt's pet bird, it gets the attention of Ethan, Charlotte's stepfather, and the supervisor for the apartment complex. Aside from his newborn son, Ethan is the only male in the family, but he has no problem with the amount of female energy around him, at least at first. Ethan isn't just a good husband or a good father. He is pretty much the ideal guy. He's charming, mild-mannered, endlessly patient, and utterly devoted to his wife and stepdaughter.
You know, I'm really proud of you. I probably don't say that to you enough. I love you.
But despite all this, Charlotte continues to hold him at arm's length,
Night, Ethan.
while he is continually chasing after her affection and trying to get her to accept him as her father. Even when Charlotte's mother tells him that her daughter practically worships him, he still feels inadequate.
Every time I try and connect, she takes 2 steps back.
Think about it. There's a new baby in the house. You're stressed and distant. She probably just thinks you're gonna bail.
Oh, come on.
In addition to working as the building super, Ethan is also working with Charlotte on a comic book called Fangirl. Apparently, Charlotte has provided the story and Ethan is illustrating. The book has even been picked up for publication and is set to go into print soon, provided that Ethan can draw quickly enough to keep up with the deadlines. But as the family situation becomes more stressful, Ethan begins to crack under the pressure that's being put on him from all sides. Between the lot of them, Ethan is surrounded by 3 generations of women, and all of them have their issues. The grandmother is pleasant enough, but she's riddled with dementia and can't even recognize her own daughter. Her sister, who owns the building, is a cantankerous drunk who radiates contempt. Charlotte is, as previously mentioned, a bit of a brat, even if she has redeeming qualities. And Heather, Charlotte's mother and Ethan's wife, is mostly fine, at least initially. Her greatest fault is that she is intentionally withholding information from Charlotte about her biological father.
Speaking of the professor, when are we gonna tell her? We can't keep pretending. I mean, the guy's been back how long now?
Yeah, I know. All right? Can I just deal with that on my own time?
One of the barriers between Charlotte and Ethan is Charlotte's deep affection for her father. Charlotte idolizes him, and makes no secret of it, even though this clearly causes some discomfort for Ethan. One of the characters in the comic that they're making is the scientist, and this character is based on Charlotte's father. And in an early scene, Ethan is showing her one of the pages that features the scientist, and Charlotte makes a modification to the character, drawing his eyes beneath his shades. She says it makes him look more relatable and again stresses the connection to her father.
I mean, the professor character is kind of based on my dad, and he's not evil.
But after she has left the room, Ethan undoes the changes, for reasons that are not initially clear. Although Charlotte believes that her father is living overseas, he's actually been in the same city for more than 6 months, just a short drive away. He doesn't seem to be helping out financially either. He has effectively abandoned his daughter, and Ethan's choice to make the character based on this man less sympathetic comes from his justified anger at the man, and the frustration at having to play along with Charlotte's misplaced adoration for him. When Charlotte sees that Ethan has undone her changes, she tells him that she doesn't mind, but that she wants him to be more honest with her.
Did you erase those pencil changes I made to the professor's glasses today?
The irony here is that Ethan can't give her honesty, both because she doesn't actually want to know the truth about her dad, and because her mother is keeping Ethan from telling her. So Ethan finds himself being compared to another idealized and fictitious father figure. In the comic, the character based on Charlotte's dad is a brilliant scientist, a master of the physical world. On the other hand, Ethan is constantly being embarrassed by his efforts to perform maintenance on the various machines around the apartment. He's always getting shocked or having bugs fall on his face, and is frequently reduced to simply banging on a piece of equipment with a heavy wrench. None of this appears to be work that he really knows how to do or has any training in. And the worst part is that it forces him to deal with a wife's insufferable aunt. In spite of all of this, though, he still has seemingly limitless compassion for his wife and daughter. When Sting's activities ramp up, more and more strain is placed on the family. After the bird is killed, it's assumed that they have a pest problem and the family calls the exterminator Frank. Now, Frank is probably the best thing about this movie.
That's one seriously fucked up bird.
And man, they do him dirty at the end. Frank clears out the apartment, but after the work is done, the aunt refuses to pay half the bill. But Ethan feels guilty and agrees to pay the remainder out of his own pocket. Here again, Ethan is portrayed as the ideal man, willing to make sacrifices himself to make up for the character flaws of others. Beginning to suspect that there is more to Sting than meets the eye, Charlotte takes her to another resident who is familiar with animals and biochemistry. And after examining Sting, the guy concludes that she is dangerous. And in a surprising show of intelligence and decency, he contacts Ethan and advises him that Sting might be very dangerous and should be sent to the Department of Health and Safety. Whoa! At this point, Sting has already killed one person. Of course, after committing this eminently sane act, the writers then decide to have Eric go full Insano style and feed all of his animals to Sting so she can grow as big as possible. Yeah, you'll be shocked to find out that he doesn't make it. Ethan then confronts Charlotte, and it is frustrating. When he asks her why she didn't tell anyone while she was keeping a dangerous spider in the apartment, especially considering that she has a newborn brother, Charlotte responds with indignation. She demands that Ethan tell her what he's done with her pet.
What have you done with Sting?
Eric's taking that thing down to the Department of Health.
When he tells her that Sting is being sent away to be studied, she, the child, tells Ethan, the adult, that he has no right to do that.
You had no right to do that.
I know that it should go without saying, but in this year of our Lord, it may be worth pointing out that this is insane. He has literally every right. And the fact that he doesn't say this, the fact that he doesn't raise his voice, the fact that he is actually pleading with her is fucking bonkers. That the mom doesn't do anything to defend her husband or control her child as Charlotte is unleashing this torrent of emotional incontinence is even more bonkers. Just look at this Muppet. Say something, lady. Charlotte then decides to twist the knife, accusing Ethan of changing her story and taking out the professor character simply because he's jealous of how awesome her dad is.
whole thing. Why would you do that?
Yeah, I don't know why
Bullshit! You just don't like him because he's based on my dad. And my dad is awesome.
And Ethan's nice guy persona finally cracks.
Is that why he never visits?
Ethan.
Oh, now you have something to say. He reveals that Charlotte's father has been in the city for months, only a 25-minute drive away. Now, to be sure, this is not the way a grown man should engage with a child, but Charlotte's lack of respect for her stepfather never should have been allowed to reach this point. The fact that a child feels entitled to speak to an adult this way is wild. Charlotte storms out of the room, and then her mother accuses Ethan of being selfish.
Thanks a lot, Ethan. That's gonna be a real boost for her self-confidence.
Well, I'm
Nice
sorry.
work.
I'm here to tell you right now, we don't care.
I mean, someone had to tell her you weren't going to. He's been back for 6 months. You should know that.
That is not your job to decide.
Yeah, it's your job to stand here and take abuse from a 12-year-old because her mom can't deal with the emotional fallout of her previous relationship.
It's not my decision. I'm her dad. Am I? Am I her dad?
This here, had nothing to do with her. This was about you.
What's infuriating about this moment is just how much disdain and disrespect is heaped onto Ethan, this absolute paragon of self-control and compassion, the moment he actually displays some extremely understandable frustration. He's basically in the right, but the whole scene is directed to make him seem like the bad guy. I'm not saying that it's a good look to tell your stepdaughter that her dad, who she adores, is actually a deadbeat loser who walked away from her, but I have a problem with the fact that everyone in this scene is being an unbelievable asshole, and only Ethan gets called on it. The problem with Heather accusing Ethan of selfishness at this moment is that the accusation cuts both ways. In a previous scene, when the subject of telling Charlotte the truth about her father came up, Heather indicated that the reason why she hadn't yet was because she was anxious about it and felt like she needed more time, appealing to her own emotional needs.
Speaking of the professor, when are we gonna tell her? We can't keep pretending. I mean, the guy's been back how long now?
Yeah, I know. All right? Can I just deal with that on my own time?
Ethan is already under an enormous amount of stress, and he's just discovered that his adopted daughter has done something incredibly irresponsible, jeopardizing the life of his newborn son. On any one of these nights, Sting could have killed Liam. He's easily the most vulnerable thing in the entire apartment. To then have to endure the humiliation of having the same child who has put the family at risk lecture him about his rights while his wife just stands there like a mute idiot would be enough to drive anybody over the edge. And even when he's being unjustly attacked and insulted on the basis of a lie, he's meant to simply pretend that the attacks are legitimate. Even when the person currently attacking him has told him that she wants him to be more honest with her, he is treated like an asshole for actually giving her that honesty. It is a very irritating scene. Tensions continue to mount, and Ethan is beginning to crack up even more. He's falling behind on his pages for the publisher because of the extra work he's having to do around the building. The next day, as he's fixing one of the machines in the basement, he receives a voicemail informing him that he's not been working fast enough, and the publishing company is bringing on another illustrator. The frustration becomes too much for him, and he begins slamming the heater with his wrench. And at this moment, the awful aunt shows up and tells him that he's fired. You take away a paycheck from your own family, he asks. You're not family, she says. And then he asks why she hates him. I don't hate you, she answers. I think you're a nice guy, but you're weak.
And like all weak men, when the going gets hard, you leave.
I'm just going to do everyone a big favor and help you out the door. This is the logic of toxic femininity. The duty of men is to stay no matter what, through any amount of abuse, even if that abuse is coming from those he's supporting. And rather than helping Ethan, the aunt feels justified in making his life even more miserable. And if she succeeds in driving him away, then she's only proved that she was right. He was weak. With the insane biochem student's help, Sting eventually grows large enough to get out of her enclosure and kills the awful aunt. And we next see Ethan and his family all gathered together as he tries to fix the malfunctioning television. Heather and Charlotte are both laughing away as the aunt's stupid chihuahua emits these ear-shattering yips, and it's the kind of thing that would easily drive any normal person insane within about 2 minutes. The background noise builds to a fever pitch, and at its peak, the television that he's been working on shocks him. Ethan loses it and punches the shit out of the TV. The room goes quiet. Heather tells the person on the other end of the line that she'll have to call her back and send Charlotte out of the room with her baby brother. Once Charlotte has left, Heather begins to mercilessly interrogate Ethan about his behavior.
Do you want to tell me what just happened here?
I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that.
Ethan is caught in a web of emotional manipulation that covers him from all sides. He desires to do the right thing, to be a good father, to be a good man. But he is abused repeatedly and has his own desire to be a good man used against him, or is shamed for failing to live up to absurd standards. At the same time, he is preemptively saddled with the guilt of abandoning his family, which he hasn't done, and even when he is clearly beginning to break under the pressure, he's offered no sympathy or compassion. He's continually undermined by the very people that he's trying to help, and then attacked when he tries to defend himself. Put simply, he seems to be driving himself insane for these people. But does anyone give a shit about him? Ethan attempts to explain himself.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that.
Whatever's going on with you, it can't be happening in front of the kids.
I'm losing it.
You're not losing it, Ethan. You're losing us. Do you understand?
Ethan has bent over backwards for these women. He's endured humiliation and abuse, all to prove to them that he's not like Charlotte's father, despite being held guilty for a crime he hasn't even committed. And now, after he's been pushed to and then past his limit, his wife is threatening to leave him. Heather goes on to say that she can't do this again.
But I can't do this again.
Which is a strange thing for her to say. It's a bit startling to think about just how little it has taken to push Heather to this point. And even after the amount of mistreatment that's been thrown at Ethan, for her to invoke the threat of divorce, of taking his son away from him, at this moment is... I don't know, I feel like I need a stronger word than bitch. And it's at this moment, as the horror of the family's dysfunction has been fully realized, that the fully grown Sting reveals herself, the symbolic connection as strong as it ever could be. And this transition from abstraction to concrete manifestation is actually a relief. A giant black widow from outer space might actually be less horrific than this family. It's difficult to talk about this movie without thinking about the cultural context that surrounds it, particularly when it comes to the gendered politics of relationships and marriage. Kat Rosenfield is a writer, novelist, and podcaster who covers pop culture and politics. She's written for publications like Unheard and many others, and in a recent article titled, "Does Divorce Make You Hotter?" she talked about women's changing attitudes towards divorce. 5 years ago, she says, all my friends suddenly decided to abandon their husbands en masse. Rosenfield then describes how, after leaving their husbands, the group of them, women well into their 30s, put on a Halloween party in which all of them wore lingerie as their costumes. Rosenfield was the only one who didn't, and also the only one who came with her hubby. During the party, she noticed that none of the women talked about their ex-husbands as if they were actually bad partners. The emphasis seemed to be that they could just do better, and their divorces were about them choosing to live their best lives. She goes on to enumerate the various bits of divorce-related pop culture from this year. Aside from the sudden boom in divorce memoirs, there was Ariana Grande's divorce album, as well as a piece in the New York Times on the model Emily Ratajkowski, I don't care how you say this woman's name, and how she seems to have set the market for a very particular type of jewelry, divorce rings, which are made by melting down the original rings and remolding them into new shapes or with new stones and themed engravings. One of the rings featured in the article had the word badass engraved in the interior of the band. If you need somebody to tell you that this is pathetic, I'll be that guy. Quoting Rosenfield again, I try to imagine a world in which we tell a man that getting divorced made him a badass, instead of a schmuck, a deadbeat, a loser who didn't try hard enough. A world in which divorce rings for men are a thing, let alone one positively written about in the New York Times. It would never happen, of course. It's only women who are seen as requiring this particular brand of cheerleading, who are relentlessly encouraged to reframe all their negative experiences as the best thing they ever did. In the recently published This American Ex-Wife, How I Ended My Marriage and Started My Life, Liz Lenz writes, I want to tell you that breaking is our power. I want to tell you that walking away is strength. I want to tell you that there is power in giving up. All of this simply goes to show the difference in how divorce is perceived based on the sex who initiates it. If a man walks away, he's still a piece of shit. But now, divorce is considered an act of empowerment for the woman who decides to walk away from her obligations. It's hard not to think about the fact that in America, and probably the West at large, women initiate the majority of divorces. Some estimates put this number at 70%. And though there's a large amount of variation in the surveys, the questions asked, and the results, In at least some of these studies, the thing that participants pointed to as the largest contributing factor towards their divorce was a lack of commitment. Often, this lack of commitment was on the part of the person who initiated the divorce, which makes obvious sense, and some were even mature enough to recognize it. As a woman from one study said, "I realized it was the lack of commitment on my part because I didn't really feel romantic towards him. I always had felt more still like he was a friend to me." It's hard not to think of all this when Ethan's wife threatens to leave him because he punched a TV. And we can contrast the Yas Queen applause given in the public arena to women who leave their husbands with the shame that's placed on Ethan, not for leaving, not for abandoning a child that isn't even his, but for simply being capable of it. Sting then attacks, immobilizing both Ethan and Heather, and manages to steal Charlotte's brother from under her watch as well. And at this moment, Charlotte must rise to the occasion to rescue what's left of her family. It is honestly a pretty good setup for a third act. Unfortunately, the remainder of the film is entirely forgettable. The final act fails to make good on any meaningful payoffs except for one. It gives Ethan a chance to prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, his commitment to Charlotte. She frees him and he convinces her that none of what has happened is her fault, even though it absolutely is. And he reassures her that he isn't ever going to leave her, even though there was really never any risk of this and the only person who actually threatened to leave was her mom. He then sacrifices himself in a final last-ditch effort to crush Sting in the trash compactor. As he lies unresponsive, Charlotte reenacts a scene from the comic book in which the daughter character revives her father from the dead. Ethan comes back, and Charlotte embraces him and calls him dad, apparently for the first time. What a sweet story. Roll credits. Except that it feels like the real monster is still lurking in the halls around here. And I'm not just talking about that gimmicky final shot of Sting's eggs. In The Babadook, the creature has this connection with the mother's secret resentment for her son, and her guilt for having that resentment and for wanting to be rid of him. This is the subtext for the entire film, in which the Babadook's presence in the house and his possession of the mother is always aimed at the eventual murder of the son. In the end, her triumph over the monster coincides with her choosing to stand by her son and overcoming her resentment towards him. The symbolic side of the Babadook is what enables it to be defeated by what is, essentially, just a declaration on the part of the mother.
If you touch my son again, I'll fucking kill you!
Psychological and symbolic monsters can be defeated by declarations, provided that you really mean it. Physical monsters, not so much. What makes the ending of Sting unsatisfying is that the issue that has been resolved isn't the one that was really the problem. Ethan was always a good man, and a strong one. He didn't have to rise to the occasion, he just needed the occasion in order for these people to recognize what was always there. And the dysfunction of his family still isn't fully resolved. The aunt is dead, and Charlotte seems to have resolved her own toxicity, but the mother hasn't undergone any growth at all. And that moment of betrayal when she threatens to leave him is never addressed. Charlotte calls Ethan dad, and that's the end of it. And ultimately, this is why the movie fails to live up to the potential of its final act. Instead of tackling the idea of toxic femininity, it changes gears to be basically a story in praise of fatherhood. But in doing so, it makes fatherhood look like the rawest deal imaginable. Hey guy, would you like to endure constant nagging and disrespect as you struggle to provide emotionally, financially, and physically for a bunch of people who will project their inadequacies onto you and never take any responsibility for themselves? No? What are you, a beta? There's never any mea culpa, there's never any moment of reflection on their behavior, just Charlotte finally giving Ethan the acceptance that she's been withholding from him this entire time. And all that he had to do to get it was literally die for her. The film's real monster has simply slipped back into the shadows. The terror of toxic, holy shit, what a fucking combination of sounds. The terror of toxic femininity is the totally lopsided demands that it places on men while relieving women of reciprocal duties, including the recognition of wrongdoing. It is even considered the role of the masculine man to actually deny the wrongdoing of women because part of their job includes protecting the emotional security of the women around them, including denying their faults.
Thanks a lot, Ethan. That's gonna be a real boost for her self-confidence.
I'm
nice
sorry.
work. Okay.
Ethan never once lays into any of these women, even though he would be totally within his rights to do so. He never draws a boundary with Charlotte, never tells his wife to stop indulging Charlotte's delusion that her father is coming back, never tells the aunt to get off his ass. He essentially never finds his balls, except against this sci-fi monster that acts as a projection of the toxicity in the family. And in the victory over Sting, this dynamic of uneven impositions of duty and responsibility isn't remedied. It's just extended until it ends up costing Ethan his life. Charlotte does get a little bit of growth in the moment when she apologizes to Ethan and recognizes her role in what's happened, She reaches a level of maturity that eludes many adults, but Ethan then absolves her of that responsibility because that's what a good man does, allowing her to return to another illusion, the illusion that she is blameless. And she does have a moment of heroism when she has to hold the door against Sting for a few moments in order to give Ethan time to plug the cord in, and that's something, but it doesn't strike me as enough. It's over so quickly and there's so little emphasis placed on it that compared to what's come before, it lands with a barely noticeable thud. The wife, on the other hand, is completely let off the hook. Since time immemorial, men have been expected to make sacrifices for those in their care. In fact, this is basically what it means to be a good man. Good men are defined by their selflessness, especially when it benefits women and children. Toxic femininity, on the other hand, arises out of an asymmetry in the way traditional gender roles and expectations are enforced on both sexes. In the West, we often hear about the oppression of women under Islamic regimes, where they are prevented from getting an education or driving or even moving around without being chaperoned by a man. And naturally, Western liberals tend to get pretty upset about this and to support causes and NGOs that advocate and pressure for the abolition of these practices. However, I once heard an interesting lecture in which the speaker explained that if you were to lift all of these oppressive restrictions on women overnight, you would not succeed in creating an equal society. Instead, what you would have done would have been to turn the men in those countries into second-class citizens. Before I go on, I want to say that I'm not an expert on any of this, and I'm simply conveying to the best of my recollection the contents of that lecture, aided by some cursory fact-checking. Women in these countries, while being oppressed by Western standards, do have certain privileges afforded to them. Probably the most significant of these is the protection from financial responsibility. This is codified in the concept of nafaka, or maintenance, which requires that a man essentially pay for the care of his woman. Women are also guaranteed a dowry when they marry, which then becomes their property, as well as female-only spaces. In order to achieve actual equality, it would not be enough to abolish the outward manifestations of male domination over women. You would also have to address the privileges that are afforded under that system of domination. Something like this has occurred in the post-feminist West, but understanding this issue requires a level of nuance which rarely ever appears in contemporary discussions about sex arrangements. Toxic femininity arises when traditional masculine selflessness is treated as something to which women are owed, an entitlement. Toxic women are then enabled to act in their own naked self-interest. In fact, it's viewed as natural for them to behave in this way. However, the man who acts in the same way gets an entirely different treatment. After a century of feminism, we have seen enormous changes in the ways in which men and women relate to each other. The general spirit of these changes has followed a consistent pattern of liberating women from the roles and duties that were put on them in more traditional arrangements, sometimes misleadingly referred to as patriarchy. Often the explicit goal of this liberation has been to enable women to realize their individuality or in some other way pursue their internal desires. In Kate Chopin's classic work, The Awakening, the protagonist renounces the roles of wife and mother in order to seek some goal of self-actualization, which she feels that these roles are preventing her from obtaining. However, men, by and large, have not seen the same lifting of their traditional duties and responsibilities. Sure, there have always been men who walked away from their responsibilities, but they've never been celebrated for it. They are still largely expected to be selfless protectors as well as primary providers in most arrangements. And oftentimes this appears to be a result of men placing these expectations on themselves. When this happens, it's assumed that men are simply not secure in their masculinity, whatever that means. And this is often seen in the hesitance shown by many men when it comes to dating women who earn more money than them. And in totality, this is often what is cited when people claim that patriarchy, make air quotes here, oppresses men too, a claim which should completely explode the very concept of patriarchy in the first place, but whatever. And this is why feminism is for everyone. Except that it simply isn't true. In the current year, the pressure placed on men to fulfill traditional standards of masculinity is not coming from some male pressure group operating in the shadows to enforce these modes of behavior. They're coming from women's dating standards. Despite frequently out-earning their male peers, this is the gender wage gap that you don't hear about, women in the dating market still often expect any potential mate to out-earn them. This same mode of liberation for me, tradition for thee, is similarly seen in the surviving expectation that men pay for dates, otherwise they may invoke the dreaded ick. These might seem like fairly petty complaints, and they are, but I choose them because they are the most obvious and familiar. They are simply the tip of the iceberg, a readily observable indicator of the more significant problems beneath the surface. such as those that emerge in the examination of differing attitudes towards divorce and responsibilities within marriage. While feminism has spent the past 70 years challenging the idea that a woman's priority must be her children and husband, there has been no corresponding movement for men, and the dramatic reenactment of this unequal system of duty is the true horror of Sting, and one that is far more potent than a quirky little space spider. This is not to say that I have any issue with traditional standards of masculinity. Yes, they are difficult and burdensome, but I think that these burdens are ultimately the road to a higher form of life. But men will simply not follow them once they have recognized that they come at the expense of their own dignity. This issue is the unresolved core of our contemporary debates about how men and women can form lasting and fruitful arrangements. And naturally, I don't have the answer, but it is increasingly obvious, especially to young people, that the previous assumptions which were supposed to lead us to a better world have failed. In attempting to avoid the Scylla of sexism, we've fallen into the Charybdis of toxic femininity. And that's really all I wanted to talk about. If you've made it this far, thanks for watching, and if you found this interesting, please leave a like or a comment, and even if you want to, think about subscribing. Alright, thanks. See you next time.